I was driving from northern Washington down to southern Utah to spend a few days with my family around Christmas. Since it was such a long trip, I decided to split the drive and rent an Airbnb along the way. I wasn't looking for anything fancy, just a place to sleep. I found the cheapest option right around the halfway point in Idaho. It was listed as a small cabin, about a mile off the highway. No nearby towns, no city lights, just forest. Honestly, it sounded perfect for a quick overnight stop. I hit the road early and didn't reach Idaho until the sun was already setting. As daylight faded, the area became more and more isolated. Dense forest stretched in every direction, broken only by the highway behind me. Eventually, my phone told me to turn onto a narrow dirt road. There were no signs, no lights, nothing that even suggested a road was there. I slowed to a crawl and carefully drove the entire mile through the darkness until I finally reached the cabin. The first thing that struck me was its size. It was much bigger than I expected. The listing didn't show any exterior photos, but it said one-bedroom cabin, so I assumed it would be small. This wasn't. The forest around it was thick and pitch black. Birds and animals called out as night settled in. I parked near the front door, grabbed my bag, and walked up to the entrance and nearly had a heart attack when the door suddenly swung open. "Didn't mean to scare you," a man said, smiling way too wide. I stood there frozen, trying to process what just happened. He introduced himself as Charlie, the owner. I must have looked confused, because he tilted his head and said, "Your room's right this way." That's when it hit me. I hadn't rented the whole cabin. I'd rented a room inside it. I was sure the listing never said it was shared, but standing there, exhausted and already committed, I convinced myself it must have been my mistake. The lack of exterior photos, the one-bedroom wording, it all kind of made sense. Charlie led me down a long hallway to the farthest room in the cabin. What bothered me immediately was how dark it was. No ceiling lights, no lamps, just darkness stretching ahead of us. He handed me a key for both the cabin and my room, smiled again, and said, "Enjoy." Then he walked away. I shut the door behind me, dropped my bag on the bed and stood there trying to calm myself. I hated the idea of being alone in the middle of nowhere with a stranger, but it was just one night. I planned to sleep and leave at sunrise. I started unpacking when, a few minutes later, there was a knock. I jumped. I hadn't heard footsteps at all. It was like he'd been standing there the entire time. I cracked the door open. Charlie stood there with that same wide, empty smile. He asked how the room was. I told him it was great, hoping the conversation would end quickly. He nodded and said to let him know if I needed anything. I closed the door, but this time, I waited. For an unsettlingly long moment, he didn't move. I stood there listening, heart pounding, until I finally heard his footsteps retreat down the hall. I locked the door. Something about him felt wrong. Maybe he was just awkward. Maybe he was trying too hard to be friendly, but it felt fake, almost rehearsed. I stayed on my phone for about half an hour listening to the cabin. Eventually, I heard a TV turn on in the living room. That helped a little. I decided to get ready for bed. I plugged my phone in, brushed my teeth, and stepped into the shower. The tub was old and grimy, but the curtain looked newer, one of those blurry, semi-transparent ones. About a minute after turning on the water, I heard a dull thump from outside the bedroom, somewhere in the hallway. I leaned out of the water, listening. Nothing. Then, through the foggy curtain, I thought I saw a shadow move. I yanked the curtain open. Nothing was there. I finished as fast as I could and stepped back into the room, then felt the blood drain from my face. The bedroom door was cracked open. Not wide, but open enough to tell me one thing for certain. I had locked it. I slammed it shut and locked it again, hands shaking. The realization hit hard. Someone had opened the door while I was in the shower. Charlie. I grabbed my phone and opened the Airbnb listing, scrolling through the reviews. There were only 3, all 5 stars, and rereading them now, they felt fake, too vague, too clean. Then I noticed something else. The listing clearly said standalone cabin. I hadn't made a mistake. Everything snapped into place in the worst possible way. I packed my bag, pressed my ear to the door, and listened. The TV was still playing in the living room, right by the front entrance. If I moved fast, I might get out unnoticed. That's when I heard it. Soft, raspy breathing inside my room. Coming from the closet. I didn't think. I threw the door open and sprinted through the cabin. The living room was empty. I burst outside, jumped in my car, and tore down the dirt road, barely slowing until I hit the highway. I called my mom in a panic, and she convinced me to report it to the police. I did, but nothing came of it. There wasn't enough evidence. The only thing the owner got in trouble for was listing the cabin incorrectly. And one more thing. Charlie wasn't even his real name. The listing was removed shortly after. I've never seen it reposted. I still like to think about what might have happened if I stayed that night. This happened a couple of years ago, when I was 23. I rented the cabin because I wanted a quiet, stress-free vacation. It was early winter, about 2 weeks after Christmas, so it was the off-season. I got an unusually good deal, which should have been the first red flag. When I arrived, the silence was the first thing I noticed. If you haven't been somewhere truly isolated in a while, the absence of sound feels wrong at first. No cars, no wind, no animals, just stillness, but unsettling in a way that reminds you how completely alone you are. The cabin itself looked exactly like the photos, old, simple, but cozy. I unpacked slowly, made dinner, and spent the evening reading by the fireplace. Nothing strange happened that night. I slept well. The next morning I made coffee and stayed in most of the day. Eventually boredom set in. Near the front door I noticed a rough, hand-drawn map showing a trail behind the cabin. According to the owner, it was a short loop, just a casual walking path. So I grabbed my jacket and headed out. It quickly became obvious the trail wasn't maintained. It was overgrown and difficult to follow, like it hadn't been touched in years. And that's when I noticed something odd. The map only showed one trail, but halfway through I came to a fork. Curiosity won. I followed the unfamiliar path. For several minutes there was nothing, just trees and brush. Then I pushed through a thick patch of overgrowth and saw it. Another cabin. Was old, rotten, moss-covered, clearly abandoned for decades. Seeing it out there so close to the cabin I was staying in made my skin crawl. I stepped closer and peered inside. The door was gone. The interior matched the exterior, decayed, dusty and reeking of mildew. But something stood out. Footprints. Fresh scuffs in the dust, not faded. Someone had been there recently. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a previous renter found this place too. Then something moved. In my peripheral vision, I saw a doorway pitch black, not shadowed, empty, like light simply stopped existing beyond it. I was certain something shifted inside that darkness. I panicked and ran. I didn't stop until I was back inside my rental cabin. I locked the door and tried to calm myself. Eventually I convinced myself it was just an abandoned structure, nothing more. To be safe I texted the owner and told him about the cabin I found. An hour later he replied with one sentence: "There are no other cabins in the woods." That didn't make sense. I had just described it to him. I didn't respond. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly. I made dinner, had a few drinks, and sat by the fire. By around 11 p.m. I felt almost normal again. Then the feeling came back. Sudden, heavy, like my stomach dropped for no reason. I scanned the cabin. Everything was dark and quiet. I walked to the window and looked out toward the trail entrance. The woods were perfectly still. No wind, no movement. That calm felt wrong. I stood there for several minutes before I heard it leaves crunching footsteps. Someone was outside. The steps moved onto the porch and stopped directly in front of the door. Silence instead of calling the police. I texted the owner asking if he knew who was outside or if someone was supposed to be there. The moment I sent the message I heard a phone chime. Right outside the door. My blood went cold. If that was the owner, why hadn't he texted first? Why was he just standing there? And why did this feel connected to the abandoned cabin? He didn't reply. I called 911. For several minutes after the call I stood motionless in the silence, knowing someone was still on the porch. I was terrified he had a key and could walk in at any moment, but he didn't. Eventually, I heard footsteps retreat. When police arrived, I showed them everything. They went to the owner's listed address but he wasn't there. Didn't answer the door. Didn't answer his phone. Over the next few days, when they finally spoke to him, he denied everything. No evidence. No warrant. Nothing came of it. I still don't know what thought. Like here I lived in a cabin deep in the woods, about 30 minutes from the nearest town, quiet, comfortable, isolated. In the 8 years I lived there, I had never seen or heard another person anywhere near my property. Until one morning, I was walking through my land when I found something strange about 300 feet behind my cabin. A campsite, cold ashes from a fire, a flattened patch of ground where a tent had been set up. From that spot I could see my cabin through the trees. Whoever camped there knew exactly where they were. I searched the area but found nothing else. Still, it bothered me. I'd never noticed it before, and the thought that someone had been that close possibly watching stuck with me. Days passed without incident. Then one Saturday night, while sitting on my back porch with a drink, I saw an orange glow flickering through the trees. The campsite. Someone was there again. Against my better judgment, I walked toward it. I didn't even grab a flashlight. As I approached, the firelight was the only thing illuminating the area. When I reached the site, it was empty. A fire burned in the pit. A tent stood beside it, but no one was there. They'd left seconds before I arrived. That realization hit hard. I turned back toward my cabin and stopped. My front door was wide open. Whoever had been at the campsite had gone inside while I was gone. I froze. No phone, no keys, nowhere to hide. I crept toward the cabin and saw all the lights were off. Inside was pitch black. I called out but there was no response. My keys were on a table near the kitchen. My phone was farther away, in the bedroom. I decided to go for the keys. As I reached the table I saw him, a figure standing in the dark corner of the kitchen, watching me. I ran. He chased me. Heavy footsteps pounding behind me. I slammed the door, jumped into my car and started backing out. He caught up just long enough to grab the handle and pull the door open slightly before I sped away. I drove straight to the police station. Later, officers told me what they found. The fireplace was raging, packed with wood, flames spilling into the living room. The cabin was minutes from catching fire. The only trace of the man was the ashes at his campsite. Everything else, including him, was gone. I moved out immediately. The investigation went nowhere. No leads, no suspect. I'll never know who he was or what he planned to do if I hadn't left when I did. If you want next, I can.